Hey everyone, thank you for joining me in session 279 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I'm really excited to share this episode with you, and especially in the context of some of the previews of this episode that you might have seen on any of the Behavioral Observations social media platforms. My team has put together these little short videos. They've clipped segments and quotes from my guests today, and the response to these clips has just been phenomenal. So they have a message that seems to be resonating with a lot of people. Who are these guests? Well, my guests are Drs. Peter Gerhardt and Shanna Bahry, and they join me to talk about a range of topics centered around supporting adults with autism and related disabilities. They are the authors of the new book, Make It Meaningful, Creating Programs That Matter into Adulthood for Learners with Autism Spectrum and Related Disorders. In this conversation, we talk about how ABA services are skewed towards younger populations, how programming for younger learners might look different if practitioners knew about what unique needs adult service recipients have. We talk about risk aversion and other barriers to promoting independence. One of the more interesting parts of the includes their wish list of skills they'd like to see all adults with disabilities learn, and how that might factor into your programming for younger learners right now. We also have an interesting discussion of having difficult conversations with parents who, for lack of a better word, whose children would be better served moving on to a more functional or adaptive curriculum, and how, some best practices to have those very difficult conversations, and a lot more. And of course, we discuss their book, the resources their book provides, the resources that relate to other functional skills curricula that are out there, such as essential living, and lots more. And you're going to want to stay tuned to the very end, because, boy, do they leave us with some fantastic advice, not just for the newly minted, but for everyone else in the field. We have extensive links to the resources that were mentioned, so you want to go to the show notes for this episode over at behavioralobservations.com, and I'll have all the links waiting there for you. And if you don't feel like going to the website, you can sign up for you have to go to the website once to do this. But once you're there, you can sign up for the email list, and you'll get the show notes emailed directly to your inbox a couple of days after the publication of each episode. It's really convenient. It's totally non-spammy. I send one email per episode, and maybe an occasional other one, but again, it's very targeted towards the program content. Before we get to the episode itself, I do want to let you know that we are brought to you by the 2024 Stone Soup Conference. And yeah, it's happening on October 25th, which is really just in a couple of days, really close. But the sessions are available after the actual date of the conference. Many people will consume the content from this conference after the actual event itself. Now, it would be awesome if everyone could participate live and have those interactions in the chat and things like that. But I also live in the real world, and people have things to do, places to go, et cetera. So just because October 25th will come and go doesn't mean you can't jump in on the 2024 Stone Soup Conference. So just go to behaviorlive.com, just Google Stone Soup Conference. You could do that, or you can just, again, go to the show notes for this episode. And when you do, use the promo code podcast24 to save at checkout. And boy, does this represent probably the most, just one of the best values in CEUs that are out there. When you use the podcast 24 promo code, we're talking less than $8 per CEU credit. So lots to like there. We're also brought to you by the Behavioral Toolbox. TheBehavioralToolbox.com is the new training site that my colleagues Anika Costa and Dr. Polly Gavoni have put together. And we are so close to releasing our next course. We'll have, by the time you're hearing this, we'll probably have our third course about motivational interviewing available. And our beta testers have been giving it great feedback. I'm going to have Polly and Anika on in the show in the next coming weeks, and you'll hear more about it from them as well. But if you want to learn about motivational interviewing in the context of working and consulting in public school settings, this is the class for you. So just go to thebehavioraltoolbox.com/courses to learn more. We're also brought to you by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. They've got a whole host of offerings, including both synchronous and asynchronous webinars, an 8-hour supervision course, a newly redesigned RBT course that's been getting fantastic reviews, To learn more, go to behavioruniversity.com/observations. And while you're there, don't forget to use the promo code podcast to save at checkout. All right, that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this really, really fun and informative episode with Shanna and Peter.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hi, everyone. I'm joined by Doctors Shanna Bahry and Peter Gerhardt. Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, guys. How you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having us.
That's very good. Thank you.
We've got a full agenda to talk about here, and about a very, very important and underappreciated topic, and that's providing services to adults with significant disabilities or adults with very specialized needs. And we'll talk more about the nature of those needs and how to support those individuals momentarily. But let's begin like we always do on behavioral observations. I'd like to hear how you guys first encountered behavior analysis and what made you want to pursue it as a career, and kind of bring us up to date with what you're doing today. So, Peter, would you mind starting us off?
Absolutely. I've been in the field for over 40 years now. I started back in 1980 when people really didn't even know what autism was, and behavior analysis was behavior modification. Mm-hmm. No idea at that time that it would be a career, but I walked into the adolescent classroom at the Douglas Developmental Disabilities Center to get some college credit, and I just sort of never walked out. You know, not only did I enjoy working with the kids, but the science of behavior analysis was fascinating, and it also helped me secure a worldview. Like, it helped me make sense of things that were happening all around me. So I just kept, moving through the field till I got to now, where I'm an affiliate faculty at Endicott. I'm executive director of the EPIC programs and co-chair of the Scientific Council for the Organization for Autism Research. And I work with Dr. Shanna Bahry, which is probably my most significant accomplishment.
Please.
Very kind of you. Before we get to Shanna's story here, so just for the audience's perspective, so this was at Rutgers that you encountered?
This was at Rutgers, and it actually was completely by accident, because I got closed out of one course where I was supposed to work. I would have worked one day a week at an on-campus nursery school. And at the end of the semester, you write a paper about your experiences. You mentioned Piaget 2 or 3 times, and you got an A. But everybody knew that, so everybody took that course, and I got put in a course which is fieldwork in developmental disabilities. So the rest is sort of history.
So literally one door closed and another one opened.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. All right. Yep. Cool. It's always fun to see that actually borne out in reality. So
yeah.
I'm sure there's a ton of accomplishments and accolades and things like that you've glossed over quite humbly. Maybe Shanna can bring some of those up through the rest of our conversation here. So, and I should also say that I don't think I got a chance to meet you in person, but I did see you speak at the New Hampshire Association for Behavior Analysis conference a few years ago. And
good.
It was, and just speaking directly to the audience here, if you haven't seen Peter in a talk before, do yourself a favor and go do it. It's a hoot, and you'll definitely learn something. So, all right, Shanna, let's hear about your background.
Sure. So I kind of fell into the fields in a slightly similar way, but I was in high school and I was working at a summer camp with individuals with autism and other disabilities. And I saw a PECS exchange. So I saw a kid exchange a picture of a pretzel for a pretzel. And I was like, wow, that was amazing. He just talked. So I went into speech and language. So I got my undergrad in that. And I was originally on that path. But then I kind of learned what applied behavior analysis was and realized, that PECS exchange was also behavior analysis. So I switched gears, went and got my master's in that. And I've been working in the field ever since. About 15 years, I've been a behavior analyst for about 10. I worked in a number of settings over the years, but I was able to kind of see adult services early on in my career. At one of the places I worked, they were kind of attached to the adult program. So I got to kind of see where these individuals go. So that kind of ignited a passion in me to how do we, make this better? And this isn't great, basically. So I'm fortunate for that experience. But seeing Peter talk several times over the years, I was always super inspired by what he talked about. And I ended up going back to school to get my PhD at Endicott, and I was very grateful to be able to be matched up with him to get my PhD. And we've been doing research and writing and speaking together ever since the last 5 years or so, and kind of led into us writing this book that we are hopefully going to touch on.
We might reference it once or twice, but we've got some other top. No, I'm just kidding. We'll certainly talk about it. But let's talk about the set the table for adult services more generally, please. I think a lot, I meant to go look up the stats on this, but on the BACB website, I don't know if those stats, I know they have different practice areas and things like that they keep track of. And I unfortunately didn't get a chance to, but I'll paint with broad strokes here and be ready to be corrected if I get some of these assertions wrong. But, I would say that a lot of the folks listening to this program are working with children with autism, many of them young children, and they're at the other end of the developmental range. And, the good news about that is that, as we know, the earlier and more intensely we intervene, the less affected by these challenges the learners have. And those are all awesome things, but there's a whole world of adult services. I had a little bit of experience with that at various points in my career. It's not lately per se, but it's a definite, working with adults, supporting adults in the community and group homes and in like enhanced foster care settings and things like that. It's a different kettle of fish. So there's a huge drop off in resources that are available, when people transition out of schools. Sometimes we're working with individuals who have long learning histories for severe and problem behavior. So someone might be, a tantrum in a 3-year-old is very different than, a tantrum in a 33-year-old, of course. So, I don't mean to answer the question I'm already asking here, but I was wondering if you guys could maybe set the table here a little bit. Talk about some of the challenges and the differences between providing services in a, EIBI or even a school context versus supporting adults in community settings.
Well, first of all, you're I think right about the distribution of behavior analysts in the field. I think for the younger people with autism, there's more resources available and more behavior analysts available. I joke about the fact that I have an entire career based upon the fact that nobody else ever wanted my jobs. Nobody's running to join that adult program, which has aggressive individuals and stuff, and geriatric individuals, all of whom are bigger than you and stronger than you and faster than you, and also who don't really care if you get hurt, and I have to make sure that I protect them. So, but that's what I love about it, is that, and I love that I'm working with adults because it's a more equal relationship.
Tell me about that. What do you mean by that?
Teachers in general, by definition, they are sort of the supervisor of the classroom. They're the ones who tell students what to do, how to behave, how to act, whether you're in a typical public school or a specialized school. With adults, it's much more I have to figure out and acknowledge that you're an adult. You have 21 years of experience on this planet. You have a right to make certain decisions on your own. You have a right to do things when you want to do things. But I also have a charge to keep you safe and give you all the opportunities I can. So it's much more of a back and forth interaction with me trying to work within the confines of who this person is as a human being, as opposed to someone with autism who I'm trying to educate.
Hey everyone, we're going to take our first break of the episode here, and I want to draw your attention to Behavior University. Boy, do they have a lot of cool webinars coming up. I'm just looking at their webinar page, and if you go to behavioruniversity.com and click on their live webinars, I know I've said this before, but I can't repeat it too often because, I see these great webinars coming up and then they sell out. So if you see something that's really interesting, like CBD and me, effects on problem behavior in autistic children, well, that one's sold out. Hopefully that'll be an on-demand one down the road. But there's still a lot of cool ones available. Like, for example, reducing staff injuries in human service settings. That's presented by Byron Wine. That's coming up. And anxiety. ABA has something for that, and that's presented by Steve Ward. So go to behavioruniversity.com and check out their live webinars, and then also check out what else they have to offer. They've got a great new RBT course. They've got supervision courses, and they've got a lot of on-demand asynchronous trainings. And when you are there, be sure to use the promo code podcast to save when you check out. So go to behavioruniversity.com/observations to learn more. And in the meantime, we'll get back to this episode with Peter and Shanna. So there are there other aspects that differentiate providing services to adults versus, younger learners that we want to touch on before I want to get into the book, why you wrote the book. And I promise folks, this is not an infomercial about the book. We will wave the flag here a little there, because it's an important work and we want to make sure it gets in the people's hands who need it. But, we want to also make sure that there's some broader lessons that people can draw regardless of whether they get it or not. So,
I think working with adults, it's the time where we're supposed to be able to capitalize on everything that went before. You had mentioned that if people who work in EI really do their job well, it makes my job easier. But all along the way, we should be thinking about what it is we're teaching that's going to be beneficial in adulthood. We continually meet adults that remain very dependent on supervision. And most of that is because we reinforce that. We don't allow people to be independent. We don't allow people to walk 5 feet away. We don't allow people, to independently go into the Burger King because they need quote unquote supervision. Why do they need it in that situation? That's the question that we don't ask. And so when they get to me, they tend to still be very dependent professional staff for almost everything they do. They have very little ability to initiate their own actions in any sort of productive sequence. And that's just our failure. That's not a failure of the person on the spectrum. That's our failure.
Yeah. I think some of the things too, I don't know the numbers for behavior analysts who work with younger versus older. I do know there's a huge disparity, but I think a lot of the problem is simple inexposure, lack of exposure to adult services. So I talked about earlier how I was grateful to have that experience, even just seeing what an adult program was like, because I think if more behavior analysts or other practitioners knew what they were transitioning to, I think they would program a lot differently. So that's what really changed my perspective on this, is just seeing that, wow, there's not a lot available and there's a lot of, not a lot of direct teaching happening. There's not a lot of professionalization of the adult world, and there's not a lot of behavior analysts. There's not doctoral level behavior analysts. And so I think what they're transitioning to is so important, because a lot of times people working with little kids, we talk about it in terms of programming with blinders on. So they're kind of focusing on the here and now, looking, 1 year ahead at most. But I think if we're able to spread more awareness to individuals to, what they're transitioning to, that there is not going to be resources like they have in childhood. And we really need to be spending these childhood years teaching the most critical skills so that they're ready for an adult world that's not ready to support them as well as, childhood world is. So
that's a really good point. I want to come back to that in a moment, but something occurred to me when Peter was answering the other question, and this reluctance to let people be independent. A lot of times, I know, speaking just for myself, sometimes those things might be shaped by experiences, where, you have a negative event in the community setting or something like that. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, okay, we need to be really on top of this. So I could see that being maybe a barrier for folks to overcome. I've also seen, particularly in direct care staff, people coming into these settings with very much a caretaker mindset, because that's what they feel that their job is. That might be part of the culture that they're coming from, and will actually, not maybe actively or passively or anything in between, maybe resist the instructions to or guidance or training to allow people to be more independent, allow people to make that sandwich in their own kind of messy way, and things like that. Is that something? I guess I have a 2-part question relative to that. A, is that something that you guys see in your work, and B, more importantly, what have you guys seen successful to help people overcome that mindset? And a lot of these mindsets are very, very strongly ingrained.
Well, one of the mantras that we have at the Epic School and Epic Adult Program is independence is more important than perfection. And I love your description of make the sandwich their own messy way. There is no real reason why he or she has to make it the way I would make it. But we often end up as behavior analysts, as educators, special educators, like that we teach it to the task analysis, it was important, but we oftentimes miss that he wouldn't do it that way. So it's still good if he makes that sandwich in a messy way. We don't really mind, all of our adolescents at the school, like they go out on Monday and they go grocery shopping for everything they're going to need during the week. And they have their own lunch schedule that they make up. And these are all severely challenged individuals. But if he goes into the kitchen to make a grilled cheese and comes out with a bologna sandwich, like, we don't care. Like, you made lunch and you changed your mind. I think sometimes we get so stuck on, I get so stuck on these patterns of behavior that we don't recognize and support individual differences. And I also think that's part of where in behavior analysis we've gotten overly enthralled with our technical proficiency when we should be enthralled with our social significance, with our outcomes. Yeah, so it should be that he made a sandwich independently as opposed to he didn't make the right sandwich.
Yeah, you got peanut butter all up and down the knife, which my kids do, and it drives me crazy. So,
right.
I think switching the staff's mindset in that too. I think the staff contingency sometimes can be perfection over independence. I think sometimes they see their job as, he has to do this right, or he has to have, his face super clean after eating, or his shirt has to be perfectly buttoned. But I think if we can switch their mindset and have them understand that the goal is for them to be as independent as possible, that's how, you as a staff are doing your job. If he or she is doing it completely independently, like, that's the goal. It's not the goal that they do something perfect. So that's what I have found helpful.
Regardless of your title, if you are a behavior consultant who is working in or with schools and you are struggling and wondering why your interventions are not producing the desired results, you are not alone. Unfortunately, those tasked with improving behavior in schools are too often left to carry the burden by themselves. You are the behavior person, so you take care of it, is the unsaid mantra. But you can't improve behavior and the associated outcomes by yourself. In fact, creating sustainable improvement in student behavior almost always requires changes in the performance of the educators. I'm Dr. Pauly, and along with my colleagues Anika Costa and Matt Sikoria, we are designing coursework called the Behavioral Toolbox. In it, you will be taught strategies grounded in organizational behavior management for consulting in schools in a way that brings out the best in educators so they can bring out the best in the students they serve. If this sounds exciting, be sure to click on the link in the description to sign up for more information.
When you use the example of going to make, I think you said a grilled cheese and coming back with a bologna sandwich, it made me think of an issue that that comes up a lot when we talk about these sorts of things in terms of balancing client perspectives with things related to health and safety and along those lines. So, if someone's eating a bologna sandwich every day, that's going to have downstream consequences health-wise. And as someone who just turned a quote unquote milestone birthday and, now is on a generic statin, I am more keenly aware of these matters, and I do try to attend to those matters. And so I think that, obviously there's been, these classic papers. I think what's the one like, the right for people to sleep late and eat donuts and things like that. Where do you guys come down on, prompting, healthy choices, both in terms of nutrition, but also prompting physical activity and things along those lines?
I'm a big supporter of physical activity in other people. Like, that's that's my thing. But
it's good for you.
Yes. We just had this discussion yesterday at the school that we need to develop a really comprehensive nutrition instruction program starting with kids as young as 5. Because if we try to do it when they're 17, they look at us like, wait a minute, you let me have the cake for the past 15 years.
Yeah.
And now you're saying I can't have the cake. It kind of pisses them off. So we need to start young, like we have to do with a lot of things, and then build the skills in an age-relevant course so that by the time they get to young adulthood or adulthood that they have some of these skills. And then it becomes more of their choice than my imposition, which is really what I want to do. There are times where I have to say, no, that's not, you can't eat the foil. Like that's like, simple ones, but also like that fourth piece of cake. Maybe that's not your best decision. So it's how do we do that? But it's a day-to-day decision-making process, quite honestly. So,
and I understand programming for the long term. I also understand that there are, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s in these settings walking around with 300 plus cholesterol, pre-diabetic, et cetera, on a boatload of medications and things like that. And they did not have the advantage of that education and prompting and shaping and all those things growing up. So for the practitioners supporting those individuals, and again, we're not giving specific clinical advice. I'm just trying to think broad strokes here, principles first.
Mm-hmm.
How do you conceptualize supporting people with those types of needs?
There are always times where we're going to have to act in loco parentis, as if we're, parents from the perspective of a parent, and adopt a much more protective, guided programming aspect. Because it comes down to individual health and individual safety. Like we don't let individuals run into the street. We stop them from running into the street. Some of the dietary stuff would be in that same category. But it has to just be an individualized decision based on the needs of this individual person, as opposed to saying, nobody in this program can have ice cream. Because that's not a healthy food. So there's always going to be those individuals who require additional support and people who will make decisions for them. And that's important that we do that. My concern is that we do it too often, and don't give people who can have some say in their own lives that say.
I see. Okay. And in selecting treatment goals and developing support plans, whether those are behavior support plans or selecting instructional goals to work on. One of the things that I recall working in adult settings is the various committees and things like that you have to go through to get permission to run a behavior plan and things like that. And I understand that those structures are in place for consumer protection, and there's lots and lots of review. And then at the same time, sometimes those things take forever. I don't know if that's an experience that you guys have down in your neck of the woods, or if, but I'm speaking at least in terms of my experience up here in northern New England. Sometimes, an individual will start demonstrating a repertoire of very challenging behavior. And it's not like a school setting where you say, okay, we're going to talk to the team, then we're going to talk to the parents, and we're going to get, informed consent, assent on the learner where we can, et cetera, and we're off and running, implementing a behavioral intervention plan based off, hopefully, some sort of functional assessment. I know that at least in my experience is it's a much slower process. Is that something that you guys see, and are there ways that you guys have learned to navigate around that?
One of the things that we do is we have our own external peer review and human rights committees that can look at a plan and approve it or reject it basically within 48 hours.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And our human rights committee especially is very diverse. We have, individuals who have with autism on our human rights committee. We have parents, we have other providers. And none of these are rubber stamp committees. They're really there for our professional guidance. So that's how we've sort of gotten around it. And in New Jersey, quite honestly, we don't need that. Like, we just have to add it to the IEP for a school, and it's approved. But from an ethical, professional values point of view, we decided that we needed to have our own peer review and human rights committee.
Okay. And when you say we and here and things like that, what is a specific agency? Again, you're just so folks.
It's the EPIC programs, which is a school for kids 5 to 21, and EPIC Inclusive Communities, which is our adult program, which is 21 plus.
Got it. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So if there are people out there working with adults who are, for whom their behavior plans are, lingering in the queue for their human rights committee, and you want maybe work in a setting where you can get your behavior plan approved in pretty short order. I'll have the link to that.
There you go.
So people can check that out. So yeah, because I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to that going, oh my gosh, what is this glorious place that can get a behavior plan, approved and greenlit while maintaining those safeguards, but doing it in a way that
Right.
allows the supports to be delivered in a manner such that you're not, someone's not being unsafe while it's kind of grinding its way through the system. So.
Right.
Cool. This is all really helpful information. So let's, as promised, let's turn to the book. We'll get into what it is, but I'm curious why. Anytime someone comes on and they have a book, I'm always curious, or even an article or whatever, I always ask why you wrote the book. So what was the hole you were trying to fill? I assume that there's some sort of, space in the literature that was not occupied by this particular work. Can you talk about what that space is and what the book was trying to address?
Yeah.
Shanna, I'm going to shut up, so it's up to you.
Sure. So as I talked about earlier, earlier on in my career, I would go to Peter's talks and leave super inspired, but as I think everyone who's gone to a talk of his does. But I did find, like, looking back, I would leave the talk super inspired, but would go back to work the next week and would kind of go back to the same old, which I think a lot of people did. And so I think one of the things that was a hole that we were wanting to fill was to give people tools to be able to do kind of what Peter has been preaching about for a really long time. So we would call it, as I was inspiring him to keep writing, we have to secure the legacy. So a lot of it was just wanting to get down on paper everything Peter's been talking about and doing for years and give people kind of a blueprint to do it themselves. So it kind of branched off from my dissertation. We created a couple tools that we used and did some research on. So it originally started was, we want to package this up to give to people to use it. And then it was like, well, we got to write something on how to use it. And then it snowballed into, well, we should do an introduction, like why the tool's needed. And then it ended up being every couple of weeks, I was telling Peter we needed to do a new chapter and turn it into a book. And it kind of just, like I said, snowballed into something really big. And so I think that was kind of how it all happens, pretty much.
Okay. And the book is, again, Make It Meaningful, Creating Programs That Matter into Adulthood for Learners with Autism Spectrum and Related Disorders. Great. And so who's the ideal reader that you have in mind for this work?
Really, it's any practitioner working with people on the spectrum or with related disorders. So ideally behavior analysts, but also teachers, SLPs, other professionals, really anyone who is responsible in some way, shape, or form for writing goals. So the idea is that we wanted to give people a way to, a lot of it, and to go back to your other question of what hole were we trying to fill, I think we were wanting to give behavior analysts and other practitioners kind of the permission and freedom to think and really approach goal writing and program development from a really unique perspective, and to just write goals and programs that are uniquely meaningful for each individual learner with their long-term thinking in mind, to really prepare them. A lot of the beginning of the book talks about the research in the field of what skills are the most needed in adulthood and how there's a really big gap between the adaptive skills that people on the spectrum have and how important it is to make sure we're teaching those skills as early as possible. So we're really trying to essentially just give people a whole bunch of tools and ways that they can do this and do a lot of what Peter, again, has been talking about for years.
I see.
And, it's also, we wrote it, I hope, in an accessible style. So I think in many cases, that there is no fine line between professional and parent. And I know any number of parents who have their BCBA.
Yeah.
So I think anybody really can find, it's accessible to anybody who was interested in the topic. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, we do translate everything. If we talk, behavior analysis, we give kind of well, here's what this means in case you're not a behavior analyst too. So we did try to make it broadly applicable.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. Very cool. Yeah, that's really helpful. So you mentioned skills that are important. So I want to ask a related question to that, and maybe it's kind of a callback to what we were talking about earlier. But do you have I guess a wish list of sorts of skills that you wish that people in the school setting were teaching these individuals such that they were, more successful as they transitioned into adult settings? And, is there one or two that you could suggest that people consider that, that might be a meta skill that, makes life, freer, if you will, or removes barriers, probably more to a more independent life?
Yeah.
Go on, Shanna.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of them. So when we talk about adaptive behavior, we're really talking about the skills that allow someone to be as independent as possible and not reliant on another person. So we talk in the book about the criterion of ultimate functioning. So basically anything that if you can't do, someone else will have to do for you when you're an adult. So whether that be a paid staff member, a parent, if someone else is going to have to do a skill for you, that's a really good kind of litmus test of what we really need to be teaching, because one, there may not be as many resources. Well, there won't be as many resources available in adulthood. And also, we really don't want people to be reliant on others when they're an adult. It's a dignity thing also. We don't want them to have, and it's a safety thing. We don't want someone to have to be having help in the bathroom or help getting dressed and things like that when they're older. So basically, all of those kind of skills, we really hope that people start teaching earlier, especially because they can be harder skills to teach. So if we can teach them at a young age, they have a much longer learning history and practice with the skills. So, and we always talk in depth about toileting. Like, you don't want to have a 30-year-old who still needs help in the bathroom. It's so important. And if that's one skill, I think Peter would probably agree that you really want to make sure that individuals are able to use the bathroom alone. It's a caregiver burden thing too. If parents are having to, wipe their child who's 35, that's a really big barrier. It impacts everything in their life, where they can go, community, things like that. So I think all of those skills are what we're talking about. And we have a list of what we call critical skills. And so there's so many that we think really want to be targeting at a young age.
Yeah, personally, I think that it should be a national law that whenever a child gets diagnosed with autism, the family is given a free bidet with the installation costs covered, so that they teach their child to use that. Because if someone in behavior analysis figures out a way to easily and successfully teach someone to wipe after a bowel movement with 100% completion, that's the Nobel Prize. Like, right there. Like, if you can do that. Because I still meet, and Shanna meets, adults in their 30s who don't wipe after a bowel movement. Like, and that is talk about like the prejudice of low expectation, soft prejudice of low expectation. Like, you have at least one trial every day to teach this. So that means he's 30. That's 30 times 365. Like, how many trials have you not done this? So, that soapbox was brought to you by
by Acme Bidet.
Yes,
and the Brotherhood of Plumbers in the tri-state area.
Yes.
Local number 1164. Yes, I support bidets for So anyway, all kidding aside, gosh, I'm kind of distracted now with but all right, back on track here. So one of the things that occurred to me as you're talking about that is that I've had a lot of conversations about this on the podcast, had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with Dr. Patrick McGreevy, not just on the podcast here, but I've had the wonderful opportunity to spend some time with him at conferences and things like that. And, he's been flying this flag for years. And I'm curious from your perspective whether or not what the problem that I'm about to describe is getting better or worse, or too hard to tell. And that is, sometimes you see situations where teams in the school, when kids are in the school years, and this is a difficult thing to kind of reconcile as, for a parent and whatnot, but, transitioning from an academic based curriculum to a functional curriculum. And, I've encountered it, I'm sure you guys have, where teams are trying to teach kids, advanced reading and math and language and cognitive skills and things like that beyond, they've hit a kind of a ceiling here. And of course, the optimism that imbues most behavior analysts, like, hey, we can teach or train anything, yada, 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 sometimes actually is perhaps not helpful in some of these situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that's a crucial conversation to have. And I'm just asking you to speculate here, so I won't hold you to this, but do you see that tendency? A, do you see that tendency? I guess. B, are you detecting any anecdotal changes in that? Are people more willing to have those conversations about, hey, what is really important for this person? I'm just curious what your experiences are.
Shanna, this is your topic.
It's both our topic, but yeah, we love Pat and Troy, and I think there's so much overlap in the EFL and then what we have in our book. One of my favorite Pat quotes is, just because you can teach something doesn't mean you should. And I think that's a big cornerstone of our book too, is we have this powerful science and we can use it to teach anything. But I think one of the most important things we can understand as behavior analysts is that there's a great responsibility there, that we need to use the science to teach the right skills with the right procedures and the right environments, and really make sure what we're doing is really going to matter long term. We talk a lot too in the book about kind of different paths, and Pat and Troy talk about this too, but kind of the developmental or adaptive path versus the adaptive behavior path. So on the first path, developmental adaptive, the goal there is to really catch up to same age peers and have them on track with, transition into school age and things like that. So, but I think the problem is that we get stuck on that path for too long. And that's I think a mistake that we make a lot in the field and other fields. Whereas the adaptive path is those skills that we talked about earlier of, all those independent living skills and things you're going to need that someone else will have to do for you. So I think really making that shift when you can and starting to think really critically, are they on track to catch up to same age peers, or do we need to have, those tougher conversations with families and other team members to say, okay, it's time to really shift, to a more adaptive focus.
When you're having those tough conversations with families, are there, and of course everything's individualized, but I'm curious, are there approaches that make broaching and having such a difficult conversation easier or more, leads to a more successful outcome? Or, are there any strategies that you could share with the audience relative to that?
Well, go ahead.
No, you should go. Go ahead.
Okay. Like, we sit down with families and do longer term planning. So, if someone is 12 years old, we sit down with the family and anybody they want to invite and say, he's 12, where do you see him at 17? At 17, do you still want to be wiping his butt? At 17, do you still want to have to hold his hand in the supermarket so he doesn't elope? At 17, let's look long term, as opposed to the IEP, which is just this important document, but it's only a year, and a year is not a lot of time. So we need to start developing bigger visions. And once we put it in that context, parents, at least in our experience, are much more likely to accept it. But I'm also have a skewed concept of it, because parents who come to me know what I do.
Yeah. So
they more readily agree than if I was just anybody, with the same degree, same talent, same interests, same goal. Like, I can get it done easier because people know that that's what I do.
Yeah.
So
I think if you're not Dr. Peter Gerhardt, I think some of it comes to with starting to build rapport with the family and getting them to trust you and know you. Like Peter's trust, I think, like he said, it comes with his reputation, which is amazing. But I think if you're not in that position, I think developing trust with the family, and I think part of the rapport building and talking, we have one of the questions in our interview tool, what skills would make your life better and your family's life better? So I think phrasing it and shifting it like that to help parents understand, like, these skills, what we teach is meant to be beneficial for your child, for your family, for your life. It's not just, teaching him to read chapter books and things like that. But I do think there is an attachment parents have, which is understandable to, the dreams that they have to potentially leave behind at some point of hoping their child would read or, know multiplication tables and things like that. But I think it's really important we do start to talk about that and shift some of their perspectives to, do you want him to learn multiplication tables or do you want him to be independent, in the bathroom or to make his own meals or to be able to be left home alone, things like that.
I see. Yeah, and just as a, kind of a side note here, someone who's done school-based consulting for, the better chunk of 20 years, nobody's learning times tables anymore. That's a rant for that's a whole different podcast. And I'm being somewhat facetious, but not much. So anyway, Peter, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
Well, I forget who said this, but she's the author of the Happiness Project. But it's what you do every day matters more than what you do once in a while. So it's that if you start in the morning and write down all the things you do, get up to an alarm clock, I take a shower, I take my medication, nowhere in this do I factor a binomial equation. So it's those things that Shane and I think you have to get to proficiency. And then if there's time, you can work on these other things. The other factor is, we talk, Shane and I, more about applied skills than functional skills. That we've both taught learners basic reading skills and sometimes even more advanced reading skills, but I've never taught anybody to be a leisure reader, to just want to pick up a book and read, because that's a different level of fluency to get to that level. But now if that takes me 14 years to get to that point and he doesn't use the skill, that's a lot of wasted time.
Yeah. I think we know a lot of this as typically developing adults, that we're not using geometry and things that we learned in high school. And, you hear typically developing people talk about, I wish they taught me to do my taxes or things like that instead of geometry, because I'll actually use that. So I think we know that for us, but I think we need to think that same way for individuals on the spectrum, because the way typically developing people learn these adaptive skills is through observational learning or one trial learning. Their parent shows them once and then they figure it out, or they help them a couple of times and then they're doing it independently. But that's just not how individuals on the spectrum learn. They need, this direct instruction in these skills. So I think we need to, these types of adaptive skills and applied skills are going to be harder to teach and may take longer. So I think we need to be really thinking about that too, in terms of how long and the time we do have, and to use it really wisely to teach those important skills.
You mentioned a minute ago about I think you might have said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have an interview in the book, and I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit more about the tools that a customer might avail themselves to? Should they go to the link in the show notes and purchase this book? What are some things that come along with that might make their job a little easier?
Yeah, the book is basically filled with tools. I would say that's a lot of the book is talking about all of the tools, and everything we talk about, we try to give a number of tools for how people can actually put it into practice. So we have, data sheets that are customizable. We have forms. We have all kinds of tools. So we have that interview tool that we mentioned, where the idea is to kind of talk to the parent and start having them shift that thinking to adulthood and long-term thinking. So a lot of the questions there are even just the idea of that, so just get them thinking about that. But the idea is it's called the Meaningful Goal Guide. So the point there is to really guide you to writing meaningful goals that are really going to matter. We have so many other tools. We have a job match assessment, where that's ideally used for job sampling. And we have all types of tools for community integration and community-based instruction.
Social
validity tools. We have, what else, Peter? We were talking about them yesterday. We have the 20 questions tool, which is something we have where the idea is once you draft goals, you're kind of using these checks and balances to see where you could potentially make them better. There's so many things in there.
Okay. All right. So that's a good enough sample, if you will. I think folks will get an idea of what they can expect when they pick up a copy of Make It Meaningful. So that's really cool. And to have the, it sounds like an opportunity. And again, I'm not trying to be an infomercial here, folks, but just, it sounds like it's just an opportunity to kind of capitalize on the experiences and strategies, et cetera, that you guys have developed and expertise over the years. And so I'm all for not reinventing the wheel. So when people can find things like this, I think it's important to capitalize on these resources. So again, we talked about EFL a minute ago. I wanted to circle back to that. So, if I were to, put my skeptic hat on here and say, hey, I've got the EFL, I'm trained in the EFL, a huge fan of, of Patrick, Troy, and everyone else, blah, 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 blah. Why do I need this book? Or is there, perhaps less skeptically stated, are there other complementary points that this resource provides for folks who are already steeped in, whether it's the EFL, AFLs, et cetera, et cetera?
You want me to take?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think, again, we really like Pat and Troy, and we love the EFL. I think there's a lot of overlap there. So they have the essential 8, and some of our critical skills are encompassed in that. So I think the slight difference is the population that it's for. So if you read the EFL, it talks extensively about what population it's for, and it's for, really moderate to severe, profound individuals. So I think that's a slight difference. I think our tool is a slightly more open-ended in that it can be used for a little bit more wide range, but it's also very different. Our tools are really more just to kind of guide the teaching and guide the thought process of the practitioner to develop a meaningful program, whereas they have like a list of skills that are all really important, really good skills, but it's different in that sense that it's not a list of a couple hundred skills, which I'm not saying that's all the EFL is. It's great. So it's very different. And I think they can be used together. They're complementary. I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. I think it's particularly the audience that it's meant for is a little bit different too.
Yeah. And I think we provided a lot more information on specific topics like employment or like community-based instruction or, than the EFL does, which again, Pat's one of my idols. Like he's a hero to the field. So
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm just glad that my name gets sometimes uttered in the same breath as his does,
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to attend a verbal behavior conference for the last several years, and Pat is a mainstay of that conference, and he consistently brings the room to tears. And that's not hyperbole.
Yeah.
It's really quite amazing. So,
Yep.
So if you're a fan of that work, then this will be a nice companion. That's what I'm getting from your responses here. So.
Yeah, I'm just funnier than he is. That's all.
He's got some zingers when you you spend some time. You don't see them coming though. It's that Midwest dryness. You don't see them. It's like, oh, hey, yeah.
Yeah, that's very true.
So, anyway, I could tell already this has been a really fun conversation because I have this list of questions, and like right as we hit the ground, they kind of went out the window, and we're all over the map here. So we are getting close to the time where I've asked you guys to commit to have this conversation. So I want to give you guys the opportunity. If there's something about this topic that you want to make sure that the audience walks away from, I want to give you the opportunity to share that. And more generally, if there's advice for the newly minted BCBA, I'd like you to leave. We can leave on that note too. What advice you might have for the newly minted? Maybe the answer is the same thing. Who knows? But I'll leave it to you guys to sort that out.
Well, for me, it always is like we, as a field, need to think bigger. We need to think in bigger outcomes. We need to think bigger goals. We need to think, how do we provide intervention in less structured environments? We need to return to this focus on social validity and, maintenance and generalization, which we rarely, even in the research, it's not often included, unfortunately, because the potential is there. And I think we also need to collaborate much more effectively within our field and also outside of our field to the benefit of the people that we serve. So the bottom line is, I think behavior analysts need to think like behavior analysts, not just act like behavior analysts. Shanna?
I think mine would be kind of multi-part but I think one important thing to remember is, children with autism become adults with autism. And we're adults way longer than we're children, something like 75% of our lives. So I think regardless of what age group you work with, which like we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, a lot of people are working with younger kids, but I think any individual you work with, we want to be looking at them as a future adult because that's what they are. So every individual is just a mini adult, or they're on their way there. So I think one of the most important things is to just think, like Peter said, think big, but also I think ahead. Regardless if they're 3, we're thinking about 5 or 7, but when they're 10, we want to be thinking about 15, 17, and eventually adulthood. So I think if we can start there and understand that you're programming for the rest of their lives, no matter what age they are, is one of the most important things.
Think big, but think ahead. I really, really like that. So
that was pretty good.
Yeah, you should trademark that. That's really good. All right, Shanna, Peter, this has been a really fun conversation. Thanks so much. And congratulations on the book. And again, if people want to grab a copy, just go to the show notes, go to behavioralobservations.com and click on the show notes for this episode. And we'll have a link to the book waiting there for you. So, all right, guys, thanks so much again for joining me.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you soon.
This has been a blast. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.